It is a pleasure to be here before you tonight in this historic chamber. I would like to thank the President for hosting such a fascinating debate and allowing me the immense privilege of speaking. The discussion around refugees is a necessary yet sensitive one. Global conflicts have devastatingly uprooted the lives of millions, forcing them to emigrate from their homes, leaving them without basic provisions, and often facing xenophobia when they seek refuge. At the same time, there are those seeking to benefit from this crisis, such as criminal gangs engaging in illicit and inhumane people smuggling at borders. The point of tonight's debate is not to undermine the suffering that those around the world have experienced, nor is it to pick apart government policy from a partisan point of view. Rather, this debate hinges on the phrasing of our motion, particularly the word engineering. This word choice suggests that the British government has artfully worked to create a refugee crisis, not in the sense of causing the motivations for refugees to leave their countries, but in failing to provide them with sufficient support. Although the UK could go further to fulfil its international obligations, this does not equate to engineering a refugee crisis. The UK is focusing on preventing domestic crisis, prioritising giving refugees safe, settled status rather than blindly opening the floodgates to crime and further human suffering that have resulted from the policies of other European countries. Not only has the British government implemented policy to facilitate refugee integration, but it is working to minimise the border crime that escalates a humanitarian struggle into a crisis. The domestic failures of some European governments could be described as engineering a refugee crisis. 5 years ago, the fatal naivety of the Swedish government created a domestic crisis as the public protested when grown men were put into children's accommodation claiming to be school age. As a result, Swedish asylum centres became subject to arson attacks whilst the police lost control of the gang-style warfare that erupted on the streets. This negligence could be viewed as engineering an unworkable situation that inevitably led to a crisis for the refugees in Sweden and the domestic population. The British government's approach has had some flaws, but it seeks to tackle these threats of domestic unrest and criminal gain from this humanitarian issue head-on. The asylum arrangement allowing the UK to send some refugees to Rwanda intends to break the business model of criminal people smugglers, a real danger beneath refugee resettlement. Breaking the connection between unauthorised arrivals claiming asylum and being able to remain in the UK could deter clandestine channel crossings and economic migrants. We ought to consider that these policies have the potential to stem the worsening abuse of our laws whilst boosting public safety and easing the pressure on our public services, which already face the strife of the cost of living crisis. Certainly, there is greater clarity needed on the logistical aspects of policy and how existing sets of refugees would react to deportation threats. However, it is presumptuous to label this scheme as part of a crisis because it is innovative, especially when these dangers have not been realised and this scheme has not yet begun. From Ukraine to Syria, Afghanistan to South Sudan, humanitarian crises of the past decade have raised the stakes for the UK to facilitate safe, legal entry for refugees. In line with this, the UK has increased the intensity of its response on multiple fronts. with multiple-faceted refugee resettlement schemes, family reunion provisions, and private sponsorship. The Prime Minister's UK-France agreement has the potential to form a modern, practical, and moral system that all Western countries can agree on. Currently, legal routes for entry are working well, and it is unconvincing to label this as part of a crisis, as engineering a crisis, when they were able to settle more than 160,000 Ukrainian refugees in less than a year. In some aspects, the UK may be denying, rather than engineering, a crisis around refugees. I was delighted to have dinner with Lord Dubs this evening. Speaking on the side of the proposition, he supported plans in 2017 for councils to come forward if they had the capacity for child asylum seekers from Syria. Regrettably, the government compromised on its international responsibilities and avoided the domestic risk of financially straining its local councils and risking child trafficking. Even so, this broader compromise of relocating refugees, collaborating with other countries, and making permanent settlement more difficult has not engineered a refugee crisis. The word crisis is inherently a very politicised term. Even if the government did not change its policy at all, there is nothing to suggest that the refugee system would topple into crisis, even if it was strained. Some politicians have alluded to the rhetoric of a crisis, using inflammatory language such as invasion, with bold arguments that asylum seekers are stealing accommodation from homeless British veterans. Despite the partisan political rhetoric surrounding this issue, in reality, there are hazardous consequences from being too cruel or too kind. Whether or not you think that there are structural grounds for a crisis to exist, this entire debate rests upon whether it is being engineered by the British government. The proposition may cite episodes of anti-migrant violence as broader manifestations of Tory government failure. However, it is not that simple. Rather than a government-engineered crisis, the Knowsley and Dover anti-migrant attacks may have been a result of inflammatory language used by our politicians, or the strain of the cost of living crisis, or perhaps the actions of small groups of xenophobic extremists. What we ought to focus on instead, and what any of these possibilities suggest, is that greater management and control over this issue is needed. Nevertheless, the Homes for Ukraine scheme did exemplify the existing public impulse to support government refugee policy. Before you leave through those doors tonight, I would urge you to consider that refugee policy is not a simple process, but, if successful, the direction of our current government can engineer closer relations to France, multiple avenues of resettlement schemes, and the prospect of demolishing the business proposition of human traffickers. Indeed, the UK is not a shining example of perfect government, and greater clarity is needed on many aspects of policy. However, that is not to say that the government has engineered a crisis. Rather, it has balanced its UNHCR obligations with its prime domestic responsibility towards national security. Thank you.